The door slid open and steam boiled out. Hack made his way through the mist, fighting his way into a small compartment. It held a desk and a greasy-looking man. The door hissed shut behind him, cutting off his escape. Red LEDs painted them both in bloody light. Hack clutched his backpack tightly against his chest. "Don't look so nervous, kid. Makes me want to rob you," said the greasy man. "What do you want from me?" "Your debit?" asked Hack. "Aye, and you are?" "People call me Hack." "Hack, eh? You from the sticks?" Yes, sir. Zone 3. I see." Hack felt Debit's eyes crawl over him. Hack looked like a kid from Zone 3. He was covered in soot and wore ragged clothing that reeked of burning flesh. "What brings you here, Hack?" I need an interface. A cheap one." "Need or want?" Hack swallowed. He'd been thinking about that ever since he left home. "Need. I can't go back to the mine, sir. I can't." Debit nodded. He'd heard the stories. Everyone had heard the stories. "Want to move into the city, eh? Getting an interface ain't easy. Even if I had one on the cheap, it's still more than most people can afford, especially runts like you." "I can work, sir." "So can everyone else that walks through my door. What makes you special?" "I brought my mining gear." Debit whistled. "Now that's some shit. Let me see it." No." Hack was trembling, but he had no intention of showing Debit his gear. "You tell me where you want a hole dug, and I'll dig it." Debit glowered. He wasn't a man that took no for an answer. Hack knew he was taking a risk. Debit was known to be a shady character. If he had an interface, it was one he'd probably cut out of a corpse. This man had more skeletons in his closet than a cemetery, but Hack had a few of his own. "All right," said Debit. "I get you an interface, and you work for me, but you work till you're done. You don't get a choice in the work." "What about when I pay you back?" "What about it?" Debit didn't seem to consider that a possibility. People like Debit kept their army of slaves bound by the shackles of rotating debt. Paying off loans in full wasn't a common occurrence. "If I clear my debt, I keep working for you, but I get to choose which jobs I take on." Debit cocked an eyebrow. "You'd be more intimidating if you quit shaking, kid." "Fine. You clear your debt, and you're a free agent." "How much for the interface?" Debit gave him a number. The number was higher than Hack had expected, but it was still manageable. Buying a used interface on the black market cost more than going through official channels, but, like most people from the outer zones, Hack couldn't afford to go through the official channels. "How much do I get per job?" he asked. "That depends on the job and how much you want to pay towards your debt. We can work it out when the time comes." Hack agreed, and they shook hands. Debit went through the formality of typing up a contract. It would be legally binding, and Debit could use it to drag Hack into court if he wasn't able to pay. Hack read through it carefully. It was straightforward. Debit was too used to his high interest rates keeping people under his thumb to work any malicious clauses into the contract. "Get out of here, kid. Be back in 2 days around this time. We'll get you hooked up with an interface." Hack left. He picked his way through the upper rim and down into the slums proper. Rumor had it that the slums circled the entire city, but Hack had never had the inclination or the time to walk around the entire city just to find out. He made his way out of the encampment and onto the plains. Miles of dirt and rock stretched out before him. It would have been a 2-hour hike back to Zone 3. Hack had no intention of going back, not ever. Instead, he walked a couple of miles to the dry riverbed where he had buried his gear. A stone bridge spanned from one bank to the other, though no water had flowed underneath for many years. A road still followed the dry river, but it was seldom used these days. After checking to make sure his gear was still safe, Hack sat on the bridge and looked up at the city. It was a marvelous sight. Spires of metal pierced the sky while weather modules sprinkled water into the city below. If he looked close enough, he could make out flying taxis, ferrying the city's inhabitants from rooftop to rooftop. Even the shield wall was pretty. The 100-foot monstrosity circled the entire city, keeping out raiders, the elements, and the poor. The slums clung to the wall like moss climbing a tree trunk. Even the slums had been divided by class. A mishmash of tents and lean-tos spread out from the city, while metal shacks had been constructed higher up on the mounds of dirt piled against the shield wall. The upper rim belonged to the corrupt and the cruel. The slum proper was controlled by scavengers and traders, and the outer camps were dominated by strung-out addicts and the diseased just waiting to die. The diseased could have gotten medical care, which was free within the city, but none of them could go into the city. Only people with interfaces could get through the wall. Anyone could buy an interface, but it had to be paid in full with installation fees at the time of purchase, a price no one in the outer zones could afford. There were stories of families saving up to buy a child an interface, but those were few and far between. The only other way was to go the illegitimate route, putting yourself in debt to a third party so you could get a used model. But if you could get an interface, then you could come and go from the city as you pleased. Hack was close. He was so close he could taste it. 2 more days and he'd have an interface. Then all he'd have to do is pay off his debt and he'd be free. He opened his bag to double check his belongings. It held the usual change of clothes, some rations, and tucked away in the bottom, wrapped in plastic and bandages, was his best friend's severed arm. "Almost there, Des," he said. "Almost there." Hack reported in 2 days later. Debbit and one of his bruisers met him out front and guided him to another metal shack on the upper rim. Inside was a table with many straps and several benches full of sharp equipment. A scrawny old hunchback gestured for him to climb on the table. Hack did as he was told and lay face down. Without a word, they started buckling the straps around him, securing him to the table. "Is it going to hurt?" he asked. "More than you can possibly imagine," said the hunchback. He strapped Hack's head to the table and placed a gag in his mouth. Hack was starting to lose his nerve. Not that it mattered. He was in it now. There was no going back. The pain came without warning as they started slicing into his neck. They peeled away the skin and began poking around inside his body. He tried to follow what they were doing, but the pain became too intense. He focused instead on screaming into his gag. A short eternity later, and they were done. The hunchback started unbuckling Hack as the bruiser fetched a bucket and put it in front of him. Debbie came back into the room, smelling of tobacco. "There, not so bad, was it?" Hack looked at the floor, tears still streaming from his eyes. He sat up so the hunchback could start bandaging his neck. He saw droplets of his own blood splattering the table and the equipment, and promptly threw up into the bucket. Debbit ignored him and went on. "Got you set up with a Type E95. Not the newest model, but one of the more reliable ones. Even installed a ghost chip." A ghost chip?" asked Hack, wiping his mouth. "Yeah, all of my employees have one. Flick it on and it will spoof your coordinates to a preset location. Can keep you out of trouble if you find yourself in a bind." Or if you're doing something illegal, thought Hack. He kept his thoughts to himself. Instead, he said, "That wasn't in the contract." "A little liberty on my part. What can I say? I want my people to be safe. Don't cost too much extra." Hack shook his head. "That wasn't part of the deal." Debbit paused, as though considering this. Then he shrugged and said, "Fine, you're right. We'll take it back out. Ermit, you heard the man." The hunchback shrugged and started taking the bandages back off. Hack took a shuddering breath and lay back down, praying it was a bluff. He held his breath and waited for the men to start buckling him back to the table. When nothing happened, he peeked over at Debbit. The sour old loan shark was glaring at him. Hack had called and won. "You win this time, kid. Don't let it go to your head." Debbit turned and left the shack. Hack sat back up and started getting dressed. His shirt was covered in blood. "Give it an hour to charge, then pull out the tab," said the hunchback. He went back to organizing his lab and cleaning his tools. Hack watched the man wipe down surgical implements with a dirty rag and wondered how likely he was to get an infection. He thought of asking for antibiotics, then changed his mind. He probably couldn't afford them anyways. He went outside where Debbit was waiting. "Here's my contact info," he said, handing Hack a slip of paper. "Shoot me a message as soon as you're able. We'll work out the details for your first job. And you better not be shitting me about that mining gear." The bruiser cracked some knuckles and put on a menacing face. Hack just nodded. He was too tired to play along with these games. He could deliver on his end just fine. "Sure, I'll talk to you later then," he said. "Hold up a sec. Where are you staying, kid?" "Camping out. Why?" "Where are you camping out at?" Hack almost answered. Then he thought better of it. "Outside. Why?" "Don't get smart with me, kid. I was going to offer you a place to stay and a hot meal. But if you want to be a wise ass, then be my guest. Sleep outside." Debbit stormed off, his bruiser following close behind. Hack wondered how much Debbit's hospitality would have cost. What Debbit didn't realize was that Hack had been playing this game his whole life. Even in the mines there was a price for everything. The system was designed to keep people mining as much as they could for as long as they could, usually their entire lives. On paper, they made good money, but in reality, by the time they'd paid off all their expenses and fees, they barely made enough to survive. Debit was used to topsiders, people who breathed fresh air every day, people who had freedom and were scared of men that might take it away. Hack was scared, but he was used to being scared. He made his way back to the bridge, checking over his shoulder to make sure he wasn't followed. When about an hour had passed, he peeled off the bandage and poked at his new interface. It was a smooth surface with a couple of jacks and slots. He found a tab with his fingers and gave it a quick pull. The interface came alive. A HUD flickered into his vision. He watched as a boot-up sequence sped past, moving too fast for him to read. The system connected to an extended network, available to the few people in the outer zones that had interfaces. It brought up a registration menu. After some experimenting, Hack learned how to use the interface. He could select options with his eyes and input words by speaking them. When the registration window asked for a name, he hesitated, debating whether or not to put in his real name. He decided against it. The less he had tying him to his old life, the better. He made up a name on the spot and put in his nickname as his identifier. Few people could tie the name to the boy he had once been, and most of those were dead. Once everything was set up, he put in the info Debit had given him. He shot Debit a message, letting him know he was online. Debit didn't respond. Hack tried not to overthink it. Instead, he killed time by staring at the city. He was one step closer, just a couple more days. When he grew tired of that, he fiddled with his interface. Eventually, a battery icon appeared, telling him it was almost dead. Using the interface over long distances or in rural areas drained the battery faster than in the city. Hack decided to call it a night. His body heat would charge the interface as he slept. He ate some cold rations and crawled underneath the bridge. He cozied in and grabbed his axe. Just holding it made him feel better. The mining tool was meant for destroying things and could do so with terrifying efficiency. As long as Hack had his axe, he could handle anything the world threw at him. He gripped the steel rod and drifted off to sleep.